You have to treat him so roughly.
Cartwright, I'll handle my prisoner in my own way.
Justice in the Wild West wasn't just swift, it was ruthless. In a land where outlaws roamed free and law enforcement struggled to keep up, punishment was designed to send a clear message: step out of line, and the consequences would be severe. Justice was quick, and mercy was rare. From vigilante hangings to gruesome forms of public humiliation, these brutal methods kept fear alive in the untamed frontier. Here are the most brutal punishments of the Wild West. Number 12. Hanging. To kick off our list, few punishments in the Wild West instilled more fear than the gallows. But what made this form of execution so terrifying wasn't just the act itself. Hanging was a widely used method of execution during the late 1800s in the American frontier. For serious crimes such as murder, robbery, or even horse theft, hanging was the punishment of choice. It was designed not only to serve justice, but also to deter others from a life of crime. Townspeople would gather to watch, often turning the event into a public spectacle, with large crowds coming together to witness these executions. The scene was set with gallows, typically constructed in the center of town, or even makeshift ones using a sturdy tree. Judge Isaac Parker, one of the most notorious figures of the era, sentenced over 160 people to death by hanging during his time as the federal judge for the Western District of Arkansas. However, only 79 of those executions were actually carried out. Known as the hanging judge, Parker enforced strict justice in lawless territories, ensuring criminals paid for their deeds. Though Parker personally opposed capital punishment, his court became infamous for its high number of hangings. The process of hanging was methodical. The condemned would have their hands bound behind their backs, a noose tied around their neck, and a black hood placed over their head. The drop had to be calculated based on the person's weight. Too short a drop would cause a slow, painful death by strangulation, while too long a drop could result in decapitation, as famously happened to outlaw Tom "Blackjack" Ketchum in 1901. Ketchum was convicted in Clayton, New Mexico, for attempting to rob a train. However, he was hanged using a rope that was too long. The miscalculation, coupled with Ketchum's increased weight during his time in jail, resulted in his beheading when the trapdoor opened. But while hanging struck fear in outlaws, the next punishment left no time for fear. Number 11. Shooting. When the law wasn't fast enough, one brutal punishment settled feuds faster than any court ever could. Shooting in the Wild West was a brutal and immediate way of dispensing justice, especially when formal legal systems were lacking. Shootouts and executions by firing squad were a common sight in frontier towns, particularly when the law enforcement was limited and outlaws roamed freely. Public shootings could either be part of vigilante justice, a duel, or a formal execution, often decided in a matter of moments. Dueling was one of the more formalized methods of settling disputes. These shootouts weren't always chaotic. They often followed an informal code of the West, where two individuals faced off to settle matters of honor or disputes. Some of the most famous duels include Wild Bill Hickok's notorious gunfight against Davis Tutt in 1865, where Hickok famously killed Tutt in the center of Springfield, Missouri, after an argument over a watch. Vigilante justice, however, was less orderly. In towns where sheriffs were either too few or too weak to enforce the law, mobs would often take matters into their own hands. Criminals, especially horse thieves and murderers, were shot on sight, often without trial. In places like Dodge City and Tombstone, gunfights became infamous spectacles, turning lawless towns into blood-soaked arenas for public vengeance. One of the most notorious shootouts was the 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. This 30-second firefight between the Earp brothers and the Cochise County Cowboys left 3 men dead and became an iconic moment in Wild West history. Legal executions by firing squad were reserved for serious offenses like murder, and they were sometimes held as public events, drawing crowds who watched as the condemned faced their fate. These executions served as a grim deterrent in a time when justice was swift and unforgiving. While shootouts were fast, the next punishment was slow, agonizing, and left lasting scars. Number 10. Flogging. When the sheriff's warnings fell on deaf ears, there was a brutal form of justice that no one could escape, one that echoed for days. Flogging, or whipping, was one of the most brutal punishments used in the Wild West to maintain control over both outlaws and ordinary citizens. The punishment was often carried out publicly, with offenders tied to posts or frames, their shirts stripped off to expose bare skin. The instrument of choice varied, but one of the most feared was the cat-o'-nine-tails, a multi-tailed whip designed to tear into the skin with each lash. It was so named because of its claw-like effect on the body, leaving deep, painful wounds. In many cases, a judge would sentence a criminal to receive anywhere from 25 to 100 lashes, depending on the crime. Horse thieves, cattle rustlers, and even those who failed to obey minor laws could find themselves at the mercy of the whip. The lashes were meticulously counted out, and a drummer was often present to mark each strike with a beat, turning the punishment into a grim spectacle for the gathered crowds. Unlike hangings, which were meant to kill, flogging was designed to inflict long-lasting pain and humiliation. The victim's back was often left shredded and bleeding, sometimes resulting in infection or even death in extreme cases. In prisons like the infamous Yuma Territorial Prison, flogging was a standard punishment for unruly inmates. Criminals sentenced to receive lashes could be tied to a whipping post and flogged until they passed out from the pain. What made flogging particularly horrifying was its efficiency, quick to administer, agonizing to endure, and guaranteed to leave a lasting mark, both physically and psychologically. It was the Wild West's method of keeping would-be criminals in line, one brutal stroke at a time. Whipping tore into flesh, but the next punishment crushed both the body and the spirit. Number 9. Tarring and feathering. Now here's a punishment in the Wild West that not only hurt the body, but also crushed a man's dignity. Dating back to medieval Europe, tarring and feathering was one of the most brutal forms of punishment used in the Wild West, a method designed to inflict both physical pain and extreme public humiliation. Unlike some other punishments of the time, this one wasn't officially sanctioned by law, but rather carried out by mobs or vigilante groups seeking revenge or justice. It was a punishment for anyone who was seen as a threat or an enemy, ranging from criminals to those who had simply angered the wrong crowd. The process of tarring and feathering was as horrifying as it sounds. The victim was stripped, typically down to the waist, and hot pine tar was poured over their body. Pine tar, used for waterproofing ships, was sticky and extremely painful when applied to bare skin. After being covered in tar, the victim was rolled in feathers, giving them a grotesque appearance. To add to their suffering, the victim was often paraded through town on a cart, subject to jeers, insults, and additional abuse from onlookers. What made this punishment even worse was that it was not only painful but difficult to recover from. The tar would harden on the skin, making it nearly impossible to remove without causing further injury. Victims often suffered burns and scars from the hot tar, and the process of scraping it off would leave their skin raw and damaged. This punishment was used extensively throughout American history, especially during periods of unrest, like the American Revolution. Tarring and feathering was a public event, meant to send a strong message to others. Step out of line, and you could be next. Tarring and feathering was excruciating, but our next punishment left a mark that no one could ever hide. Number 8. Branding. In the Wild West, there was a punishment so severe that it didn't just scar the skin, it burned a mark into a person's soul for life. Branding, a punishment typically reserved for marking cattle, became a horrifying form of frontier justice for humans during the lawless days of the Wild West. Criminals, particularly those convicted of theft, were sometimes sentenced to have their flesh burned with a hot iron as a permanent reminder of their crimes. The practice had roots in older European penal traditions, but was adopted by American settlers as both a punishment and a deterrent. In a land where the law was scarce and jails were often too full or non-existent, branding was seen as a practical way to mark offenders publicly, turning them into walking symbols of their criminality. Branding was typically performed using a red-hot iron, heated in a fire until it glowed. The iron was often marked with a specific symbol, sometimes the letter T for thief, or other characters that represented the nature of the offense. For example, horse thieves were often branded with the letters HT for horse thief, ensuring everyone knew their precise transgression. This was applied to the skin, usually on the cheek or forehead, in full view of gathered townspeople. The process was excruciating, and the resulting scar was permanent, serving as both punishment and a lifelong mark of shame. What made branding even more harrowing was the fact that a poorly heated iron or a botched branding could leave infections or even kill the offender due to complications. In some cases, branding was combined with other punishments. A thief, for example, might be whipped first and then branded, compounding the pain and humiliation. Branding was also used as a way of identifying repeat offenders, making it impossible for them to escape their criminal past. The sight of a branded criminal served as a stark reminder to others about the consequences of stepping outside the law. While branding might seem like a practice lost to time, its echoes can still be felt today in some areas of cattle ranching, where branding remains a way to mark ownership. If branding scarred criminals for life, our next punishment left them helpless and exposed. Number 7. Stocks and pillories. Some punishments didn't leave the offender behind bars, but rather out in the open, trapped, exposed, and vulnerable to more than just the weather. The stockades and pillories were some of the most humiliating and painful punishments used in the Wild West. These punishments were designed to shame and degrade offenders for relatively minor crimes such as public drunkenness or even adultery. Pillories consisted of wooden boards with holes where the offender's head and hands were locked in place, forcing them to stand upright for an extended period of time. Often placed in public squares or markets, they allowed crowds to mock, throw rotten food, and even assault the criminal. This form of punishment wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was about stripping away one's dignity in front of the entire community. Stocks, by contrast, confined only the feet, which could force the person into a seated position. Some variations trapped both hands and feet, adding further discomfort. The duration of these sentences varied depending on the crime, but even a short stay in the pillory could cause severe physical discomfort. Offenders could be left standing for hours in extreme heat or cold, subjected to cruel taunts from passers-by. In some cases, individuals were kept in the stocks or pillories for multiple days, their exposure becoming a form of torture as much as public ridicule. While these methods of punishment may seem archaic, they were a staple in the Wild West, where local lawmen sought quick and public ways to maintain order in small, often lawless communities. These punishments were as much about societal control as they were about discipline, ensuring that everyone who witnessed the humiliation would think twice before committing a crime. Being trapped in stocks was bad enough, but what happens when punishment involves permanent disfigurement? Number 6. Ear cropping and nose slitting. In the harsh, unforgiving frontier, there was a punishment so brutal that it forever changed how criminals looked. Ear cropping and nose slitting were some of the most horrifying forms of punishment used in the Wild West, particularly to permanently disfigure criminals, making them outcasts in their own communities. These brutal acts were designed not just to inflict immediate pain, but to serve as a lifelong mark of shame. For a thief or a traitor, having their ears cropped or their nose slit was far worse than a whipping, because while physical pain fades, these punishments are visible for life, a constant reminder of their crime and a signal to society to shun them. Ear cropping involved cutting off parts or all of the ear, usually using a sharp blade. Sometimes, the ears would even be nailed to a pillory or post, making the criminal tear them off as they tried to move. This cruel method was common in the 18th and 19th centuries and continued in isolated cases during the Wild West era. Records indicate that ear cropping was used not only for theft, but also for crimes like counterfeiting, perjury, and more. Nose slitting was equally terrifying, often reserved for more serious offenses like treachery or betrayal. It was especially common in Native American cultures and early frontier law. The Apache and Creek tribes, for example, were known to use nose slitting as a form of punishment for infidelity. Offenders' noses were cut, leaving them permanently disfigured and marked for their crimes. Both of these punishments served dual purposes. They deterred others from committing similar crimes and ensured that the criminal's misdeeds could never be hidden. Criminals subjected to these mutilations often faced lifelong isolation, losing the ability to reintegrate into society, which was the harshest consequence of all. These punishments were, in a sense, an early form of social ostracism. Physical mutilation was horrifying, but the Wild West had even more grueling ways to punish criminals. Before we move on, here's today's subscriber's pick. This image is a dramatic depiction of one of the many brutal punishments that took place in the Wild West. Chaining criminals in public was not just a method of restraint, it was an act of humiliation meant to break their spirit. In this artistic portrayal, we see a woman bound in chains in public. The man next to her holds a long stick, symbolizing the physical and emotional abuse these prisoners faced as they were left at the mercy of both the townspeople and the harsh environment. Crimes such as theft, public drunkenness, and disorderly conduct could all lead to such punishment. This form of punishment wasn't simply about keeping criminals in place, it was a public spectacle designed to send a message to everyone watching. Lawbreakers would not just suffer, they would be disgraced. Exposed to the elements, these individuals were ridiculed, sometimes for days, and were treated as entertainment for the very community they had wronged. What do you think about such harsh measures for crimes that by today's standards might seem minor? Let us know in the comments section below. Number 5. Chain gangs. What if your sentence didn't just bind you to your crime, but to other criminals? Chain gangs were one of the most grueling forms of punishment in the Wild West, used to punish criminals while simultaneously extracting hard labor from them. Prisoners, usually shackled together by the ankles, were forced to work on tasks like road construction, clearing land, or breaking rocks. The practice emerged as a way to both punish offenders and provide free labor for infrastructure projects. This form of penal labor began gaining traction after the American Civil War, especially in southern states like Georgia, Texas, and Alabama. Chain gangs weren't just about hard labor, they were also about humiliation. Prisoners were forced to work while bound in chains, making escape nearly impossible and ensuring that they were continuously reminded of their captivity. The shackles themselves, often heavy and painful, could cause infections or wounds, and the physical demands of the labor, combined with the searing heat, made the conditions unbearable. In some cases, prisoners were chained together for days without proper access to food or rest. This practice spread rapidly throughout the United States during the late 1800s and was particularly brutal in the South. Chain gangs were often used to control former slaves and African Americans after the end of slavery, exploiting their labor under the guise of punishment. Despite the harshness of the system, chain gangs continued well into the 20th century before facing public outcry and reform. Some states, like Alabama, even reintroduced chain gangs as late as the 1990s, claiming it was an effective deterrent to crime. However, criticism grew around the inhumane conditions, and eventually many states were forced to end the practice. If chain gangs weren't brutal enough, our next punishment put criminals in a deadly race for survival. Number 4. The gauntlet. The next punishment on our list is so brutal that it turns an already terrifying ordeal into a deadly race, where every step forward could be your last. Running the gauntlet was one of the most grueling punishments in the Wild West, a practice borrowed from Native American traditions and military discipline. The concept was simple, yet savage. The offender was forced to run between two lines of men armed with sticks, whips, or other weapons. Each person in the line was expected to strike the runner as they passed, making the run not only physically punishing, but also psychologically torturous. Native American tribes, particularly the Shawnee and Lenape, often used the gauntlet as a form of punishment or initiation. Prisoners or captives were made to run through rows of warriors wielding weapons, striking them with tomahawks, clubs, or whatever else was at hand. The goal wasn't always to kill the runner, but to inflict significant pain and humiliation. In the Wild West, the gauntlet was sometimes used as a military punishment, especially in the case of deserters or those guilty of mutinous acts. For example, during the Lewis and Clark expedition, soldiers like Moses Reed were forced to run the gauntlet after being found guilty of desertion. Reed had to endure multiple passes through the gauntlet, with each man in the party required to strike him 9 times, totaling over 800 blows. This collective violence made it one of the most dreaded punishments. Beyond the physical pain, the gauntlet was a display of public humiliation, reinforcing social control and discipline within tight-knit communities. The gauntlet may have been brutal, but our next punishment left criminals trapped in public for days, enduring pain and humiliation. Number 3. Shackling and caging. When jails couldn't hold them, one punishment made sure outlaws couldn't run. Shackling and caging were common punishments in the Wild West, used to control criminals when jails were few and far between. The practice of shackling involved placing iron restraints around the wrists or ankles, often chaining the individual to a stationary object. It wasn't just about confinement, It was about humiliation, as offenders were sometimes left shackled in public for extended periods. Townsfolk could pass by, openly mocking the prisoners, adding a layer of social punishment to their physical discomfort. In more extreme cases, criminals were placed in metal cages. These cages were typically small, cramped spaces designed to limit movement, ensuring the prisoner would be uncomfortable for the entire duration of their sentence. The cages were often set in public places as a deterrent, sending a clear message to anyone who considered breaking the law. Cages could be left exposed to the elements, forcing criminals to endure scorching heat, freezing temperatures, or storms, further intensifying the punishment. Shackling was commonly used for minor offenses like public drunkenness or petty theft, whereas caging was often reserved for more serious criminals awaiting trial or further punishment. These methods were particularly effective in frontier towns where the construction of proper jails was impractical due to limited resources. Though shackling and caging might seem less lethal compared to hanging or shooting, they were brutal in their own way. Being shackled and caged was bad, but the Wild West had even more brutal methods of punishing criminals, this time at sea. Number 2. Keel hauling. Some punishments tested a man's body, but this one tested his will to survive in a place where mercy was scarce. Keel hauling, one of the most brutal punishments in maritime history, involved dragging a sailor beneath the keel of a ship, scraping them across sharp barnacles and the ship's wooden hull. The Dutch Navy famously used this practice from the 16th to the 18th century, but rumors suggest that it found its way into the American frontier on rare occasions, especially in regions with riverboats or makeshift maritime setups. The punishment was never about a quick death, it was about inflicting maximum suffering. A rope was tied around the victim, who was thrown overboard and dragged under the ship from one side to the other. Sailors would often suffer broken bones or deep cuts from barnacles as they were smashed against the ship's hull. If the sailor survived, they were left permanently scarred or disabled. In many cases, the victim drowned or was fatally crushed against the keel. The speed of the ship determined how brutal the punishment would be. A fast-moving vessel could kill the sailor instantly, while a slower speed prolonged the agony, ensuring the person experienced every second of pain. If the injuries weren't deemed severe enough, the captain could order the sailor to be keel-hauled again. This punishment wasn't just about enforcing discipline, it was a powerful warning to the rest of the crew, demonstrating the severe consequences of defiance. If being dragged beneath a ship wasn't brutal enough, imagine being crushed under the weight of your own silence. Number 1. Pressing with heavy stones. The last punishment on our list is so simple, yet excruciatingly agonizing. Pressing with heavy stones is known technically as peine forte et dure, Latin for strong and hard punishment. While more commonly associated with medieval Europe, particularly in cases where a defendant refused to enter a plea, this brutal method of punishment found its way into colonial America and left its chilling legacy into the era of the Wild West. The concept behind peine forte et dure was horrifying in its stark brutality. If a defendant refused to plead guilty or not guilty in court, they would be stripped, bound, and made to lie flat on the ground. Heavy stones, or iron weights, were gradually added to their chest, crushing the life out of them if they did not eventually submit a plea. This punishment was not just about death, it was about forcing a person to yield their silence through excruciating physical pain. The intent wasn't always to kill, but to coerce, though many victims succumbed under the tremendous pressure. One of the most infamous cases of pressing occurred during the Salem witch trials in 1692. Giles Corey, an elderly man accused of witchcraft, refused to enter a plea. As a result, he was pressed to death over the course of several days, famously demanding more weight as the stones were piled on top of him. His refusal to plead ensured that his property would pass on to his heirs rather than be confiscated by the state, highlighting the lengths to which some individuals went to defy the cruel justice of the time. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.